Hello and welcome back. If you're new to the channel, I am Ricardo, aka the Mad Hatter, and I'm a professional colorist and retoucher. First and foremost, thank you to all of you who subscribe to the channel. The support you're giving me is great. It pushes me to continue producing this content, and I really hope you continue to enjoy it. We just passed 300 and we're already on the road to 400. So thank you. So again, if you're new, in this series, we're exploring how color theory can help us become better colorists or in general professionals who work with light and color. With the last video, we wrapped on the second macro topic of the series, which was color. And now, as I was planning how to progress this, you should know I have a list that I prepared way before I uploaded the first video that has all the topics that I want to talk about. Next up, we should have had color gamuts and color spaces. And I know this is a very complicated topic that many of you might be wondering how to properly use. We're gonna go on that, but the way I built the list is through basically the questions that I get asked as a trainer. I've been doing that for about 3 years now, 2 to 3 lessons a week, so you can imagine how many people I've met thus far. And as I was scripting the video about color spaces, I realized that there is one question that I get asked almost always by new students. How do I get a cinematic image? And usually what I reply is, well, how do you define cinematic in the first place? Does it have to do with the camera you're using? With how you set the light? With how you're framing the image? And most importantly, does color grading impact that? Or is it just secondary? So this is what I want to talk about next. As we did for previous topics, we're going to break this down into smaller, easy to digest videos. And we're going to sort of follow a series of questions which are, first of all, what is cinematic? What is that we perceive as cinematic? Then, why is it so important to us to get a cinematic image? And finally, how do we achieve that in color grading? Because the answer is, yes, you can achieve that in color grading. At least partially. Well, what is it that we perceive as cinematic? Very generally, what we usually perceive as cinematic is something that is coherent to how our eye would see in the real life. Beware that this doesn't mean that an image needs to be realistic. It's more about, if I was in the scene, would my eye perceive the scene like this or like that? Many of the elements that are necessary to make this happen necessarily come from production. We won't cover them in details in this series, as we're going to focus on the post-production part. Still, very generally, what you should care about is the frame rate, because at the end of the day, frames are still images. And you need a certain number of them in a second to trick your eye into thinking that those are actually a video and not a sequence of stills. Our vision has a persistence of about 1/30 of a second. This means that once you take an object out of in front of our eyes, the brain still perceives it for about 1/30 of a second. Thus, you need a minimum of 24 to 30 frames in a second to trick the brain into thinking that those are actually a video. This persistence creates another effect that is very important to creating an image that feels coherent to reality, which is motion blur. Since our vision has persistence, when an object moves very fast, it leaves a trail behind it. This trail needs to be replicated correctly in a video to give a coherent feel to that. Finally, there's the depth of field. If you think about a video shot with a phone, probably that won't look cinematic, and this is mostly because everything is in focus. Our eye is not able to focus on everything on any given distance if you have multiple objects at different distances from your eye. Correctly reproducing that effect through lenses is crucial to get a beautiful image, a cinematic image. Now, as we said, there are a lot of other things like how you set the lighting, how you frame things. Those are more related though to a stylistic choice, so we're not going to talk about them now. Thinking now more about light and color and how those impact an image in how it feels cinematic, again we need to go and look at how our brain sees. In the real world, light works in linear. This means that if you double the amount of light, you get twice the brightness. Very intuitive actually. The problem is that if you think about the difference in brightness between the interior of a cave and the bright sunlit outside of it, the difference in brightness there easily gets up to 20 or more stops of dynamic range. To get such a dynamic range in linear would require an incredibly complex apparatus, and our eye is not capable of that. So what happens is that our brain actually converts the stimuli, the signal from our eye, into log. We're gonna now jump into DaVinci to look at how that impacts the dynamic range and how then the brain effectively decodes this log information to give us a proper vision.
So what you can see here is a reproduction of about 17 stops in linear. And you might argue, well, you can see maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 stops here, and that's it. Effectively, there are more stops above. It's just that in linear, this is way too much. And this is sort of the situation that our brain is presented with. It needs to find a way to be able to see these other stops without sacrificing too much. So as we said, what the brain does is it converts this linear signal into a log signal. And as you can see, as soon as this signal becomes log, and this is the same exact signal, you can see that we get all these stops visible. And being in log, of course, there is much more detail in the shadows than in the highlights. That is another very important characteristic of our vision. We're much better at seeing differences in darkness than in highlights, just because of how our vision has evolved. Now though, this image, you can see it's really poor, has basically no contrast. This wouldn't be useful to us. So what then our brain does is it introduces back contrast. And what this creates is this. Okay, we introduce back contrast, but you see, we're basically losing again top and bottom. So the brain introduces contrast back around where it is exposing to. So you can see how it's centering the contrast around middle gray here. But now, of course, as we said, this would be ruining the work that he has done to get the detail, in the highlights and in the shadows. So what happens is that the brain actually introduces rows of at the top and the bottom, and these are this, okay? And if you notice something familiar in this curve, this is the S-curve. And the reason why the S-curve looks so good to us when we introduce it in our grades is because that is effectively what our brain is doing. It is actually adding the S-curve to be able to keep the details on the top and on the bottom. Again, these are not such important details where the brain is thinking, okay, I need to find a way to have the same amount of detail in the midzones, in the shadows, in the highlights. No. The major detail needs to happen around where the brain is exposing to. Then the highlights and the shadows can be compressed, but you can see it's very minimal, but you can see the difference between these two patches. Okay, this is the beauty of a soft roll off. You keep all the details and yet you get a very interesting contrast.
Thinking now about the color side of things, there is actually a range of luminosity in between which our eye and our brain is capable of perceiving color. This basically means that if a stimuli is too bright or too dark, the brain won't detect color. This is something you experience every day if you are in a very dark room and you basically turn your vision into black and white. You still see the details, the contrast, but you lose the entire color information. This is actually just as true as you go up in luminosity. You might have noticed this in a very sunny day if you look at something a bit reflective or, simply a bit bright, it sort of washes out, it loses color. So what happens basically is that our brain has a range where it has the peak of intensity in color, and that range is just about around the midtones. With film and how it was developed, this is not really an issue. film works in subtractive, which means that if you want to get more saturation, you automatically get a darker color. And on the other end, if you want to get something bright, automatically you get it less saturated. With digital cameras, that is not the case. Digital works in an additive way in RGB, which means that if you want more saturation, you need to inject more color and thus more brightness. So this is why with digital images, you can get effectively colors that look very bright and very saturated at the same time. This though doesn't feel natural to us, doesn't look right to us. If you want your digital images to have a more vision-like response between saturation and luminance, you can watch this video here that I published a few weeks ago. In the next video, we're going to look at how to achieve these results in different ways depending on your situations, as well as how to get more weight, more density to the saturated areas so that they look coherent to how you would see them in the real world. As always, thank you for watching this video, thank you for your time. If you don't want to miss the next one, make sure to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. Thank you for watching and I'll see you soon.